Eleanor stood in her modest yet well-kept kitchen, stirring a pot of lentil soup as sunlight poured in through the floral curtains. The aroma of herbs and slow-cooked broth drifted through the house, mingling with the faint scent of the lilies she had placed in the living room that morning. She had trimmed the garden, ironed her best blouse, and even lit the sandalwood incense Richard always said reminded him of their early years. The calendar above the telephone still had the day, circled in red ink, an anniversary that had once been a sacred tradition. 45 years. Not a small number, not a casual memory. It was a lifetime of shared winters and warm nights, of raising children and settling differences, of laughter in the hallway and silence that sometimes grew too loud. Asterisk, the clock ticked, in a rhythm that seemed unusually loud in the quiet of the house. Eleanor checked the time again. He should have been home by now. In the early years, Richard would come through the door with a bouquet in his hand and a mischievous grin on his face. Once, he had even cooked for her, fumbling over the stove, but managing a half-decent lasagna that they still laughed about years later. But as time passed, the gestures dwindled, the surprises turned into obligations, and then into forgetfulness. Yet Eleanor never stopped trying. She always remembered, not just anniversaries, but the way he liked his coffee, the silence he preferred during the news, the exact brand of socks he liked that no longer sold in stores. She remembered it all. Asterisk, today, she had dressed in soft lavender, the color she had worn on their 10th anniversary. She looked at herself in the mirror and tried to see the woman she once was. The lines on her face were deeper, her hands a bit shakier, and her hair, once black as a raven's wing, was now a gentle gray that framed her face with wisdom rather than wear. She thought of the children, both living their separate lives in distant cities, sending occasional calls and digital greetings. There would be no family dinner tonight, no grandchildren laughter echoing through the halls, but she had expected at least a little recognition. Asterisk, Richard came home later than usual, carrying a plastic grocery bag with his favorite evening snacks. Nothing fancy, nothing thoughtful. He placed the bag on the table, kissed her cheek absent-mindedly, and asked if she had remembered to record the cricket match. Eleanor blinked at him, waiting for the pause, the moment of realization. But it never came. He sat down in front of the television, legs stretched out, flipping channels like it was any other Thursday. Asterisk, the soup simmered, forgotten. She watched him from the doorway for several minutes, trying to decide whether to say something. She wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he had planned something later. Maybe he had hidden a surprise in the car. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't it. But the evening dragged on with the sound of sports commentary and crunching chips. She brought him his tea, hoping her silence would speak for her, but he thanked her with the same casual nod he gave every day. Asterisk, by 9, the truth was undeniable. He had forgotten, completely. Asterisk, Eleanor sat on the edge of their bed, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't angry, not exactly. Anger would have been easier to carry. It was disappointment that weighed her down, not just for the forgotten anniversary, but for everything that had slowly slipped away between them. The little notes, the long conversations, the inside jokes. When had they stopped seeing each other as people with hearts that needed attention and started existing like furniture in each other's lives, useful, familiar, but neglected? Asterisk, she remembered the young girl she once was, standing in her wedding dress, nervous and full of hope. She remembered how Richard used to look at her then, like she was both mystery and answer wrapped into one. That gaze was gone now, replaced by years of convenience and habits and quiet drifting. Asterisk, that night, when she crawled into bed beside him, Richard didn't say anything. He was half asleep, his breath steady, one hand resting on his chest. Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts loud in the silence. She had never asked for much. She didn't want diamonds or candlelit dinners. All she wanted was to be remembered, to matter, to feel seen. Asterisk, sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with odd dreams, her younger self running down a hallway full of locked doors, voices echoing that she couldn't understand. She woke up at dawn, the sheets twisted around her legs. Richard was already up, in the kitchen, clanging dishes, humming an old song he liked. The morning was starting just like any other, and that hurt more than if he had remembered and simply chosen to ignore it. Asterisk, she didn't say anything that day. Not about the anniversary, not about the silence, not about the sadness that had settled inside her chest like a permanent resident. Instead, she moved through the day with quiet dignity, putting on the face she had worn many times before, the one that smiled and nodded and made small talk, even while pieces of her were quietly breaking inside. Asterisk that night, when she sat down with her journal, a ritual she had abandoned years ago but suddenly craved. She wrote only one line, asterisk, he forgot our anniversary, but I will remember this, and she did, not as a date, but as the turning point, the silent beginning of something else stirring inside her. Asterisk, the story didn't end that day, but it changed. Something in her had shifted. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew one thing with certainty: she would not forget what it felt like to be invisible in her own home, and that memory, unlike the anniversary, would not be ignored. Asterisk, the morning light filtering through the curtains brought no sense of peace, only a dull ache that reminded Eleanor of the previous night. She moved slowly, as though her limbs carried the heaviness of something invisible yet overwhelming. The forgotten anniversary had dug deeper than she wanted to admit. It wasn't simply about the date or the flowers or the absence of a celebration. It was about what that absence represented, how easily she could be overlooked, how casually she could fade into the background of Richard's life like a piece of old wallpaper, still there, but forgotten. Asterisk, she was sitting by the window, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, when Richard walked in with a strange air of calculated calm. He wasn't in a rush like usual. There was no newspaper under his arm, no casual banter, no mention of the weather or the cricket match. Instead, he sat down across from her, his eyes darting around the room, then resting on the coffee table as if it held the answer to something he hadn't figured out yet. Eleanor noticed the difference immediately. Something was coming, and not something kind. Asterisk, I was thinking, he began, tapping his fingers against the table rhythmically. We should probably talk about the house. Asterisk, her cup paused midair, just inches from her lips. She blinked slowly, unsure she had heard him right. The house, she asked, her voice quiet but not weak. Asterisk, he cleared his throat. Yes, I mean, it's getting complicated with the taxes, the paperwork, all of it being under your name. Maybe it's time we just put it all under my name, or jointly at least. I mean, what if something happens to you? Asterisk, the words hit her like ice water. She set the cup down, the clink of porcelain against wood sharper than usual. She looked at him, really looked at him. His eyes didn't meet hers. He was still tapping, still calculating, as though rehearsing a script he didn't believe she'd question. The timing was too perfect or too careless. One day after their anniversary, the day he'd completely forgotten, and now this. Asterisk, Eleanor took a deep breath and tried to keep her composure. Why now? She asked. Asterisk, Richard forced a smile. Well, it just makes sense. Less hassle for the future. You know how things are with paperwork. Lawyers, inheritance. It's all very messy. Asterisk, she didn't respond immediately. Her eyes traveled to the framed photographs on the mantel, their wedding photos, now faded and leaning slightly, the family vacation in Murray, a picture of their daughter holding her first baby. These weren't just memories. They were proof that this house was more than bricks and cement. It was years of her life, years of tending, of saving, of managing every little corner while Richard traveled, while he built his business, while he delegated the emotional labor to her. Asterisk, she could have exploded, could have accused him of scheming, of betrayal, of being so heartless to forget their anniversary and then bring up legal changes like it was an ordinary household decision. But she didn't. Instead, she watched him, waiting for a crack in the mask he wore so effortlessly. Asterisk, what brought this on? She asked again, more calmly. Asterisk, he shifted uncomfortably. I spoke to Orif the other day, the property guy. He mentioned how, in many households, the husband usually holds the papers. It just made me think, that's all. Asterisk, she nodded, slowly, and this thought came right after forgetting our anniversary. Asterisk, Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. Come on, Eleanor, don't turn this into a drama. I didn't forget, on purpose. I've had a lot on my plate. Things are tight. You don't understand the kind of pressure I'm under. Asterisk, now, she understood. It wasn't just about legality or names on paper. It was about finances, pressure, maybe even debt. She'd seen signed strange phone calls at odd hours, receipts he didn't want her to see, discussions about missed opportunities with his old friends when he thought she wasn't listening. Something was wrong in his world, and he thought her house could become his safety net. Asterisk, Eleanor stood up, quietly collecting the empty cups. She didn't want to fight, not yet, not without understanding the full picture. "I'll think about it," she said, keeping her tone even. Richard looked surprised but relieved. He nodded, as though she had just handed him a piece of gold. "That's all I'm asking. Just consider it. We'll go to the lawyer together next week. Maybe." She walked into the kitchen without another word, the cups trembling slightly in her hands. Once out of sight, she leaned against the counter and let the silence settle around her like a second skin. The coldness in her chest was spreading, not in anger but in clarity. She wasn't just being asked to hand over property, she was being asked to give up her last shred of security, her final piece of independence, under the disguise of convenience. Later that day, Eleanor went up to the attic, where she kept old files and documents. She pulled out the thick folder labeled House. Inside were all the original papers, the sale deed, the tax records, every detail meticulously organized. Her father had helped her buy this house before her marriage, something she had insisted on keeping in her name. She remembered the stern lecture he had given her. "Always have something that's yours, not your husband's, not your children's, yours." She held the folder tightly, as if her father's voice still echoed from the yellowed pages. If she gave in now, it wouldn't just be about losing property, it would be about surrendering her autonomy. Everything she had protected for decades. That night, Richard was cheerful. He asked if she wanted to go out the next day, maybe for lunch. It was a strange change of pace, almost like guilt in disguise. Eleanor nodded politely, all while something inside her began forming a plan. She began observing more keenly after Thatch's moods, his phone calls, his patterns. She noticed him stepping outside to talk, erasing messages from his phone, casually mentioning a business opportunity with a distant cousin. Her instincts were right. He wasn't being honest. He was preparing something, perhaps a mortgage, maybe even a sale, and the house papers were a necessary tool for him. Eleanor didn't confront him yet. Instead, she visited a local lawyer quietly, using the name of a school friend to arrange the meeting. She asked about asset protection, about changing her will, about securing her documents. The lawyer, a woman in her 40s with a firm but kind demeanor, listened carefully and nodded. "You're wise to come now," she said. "Too many people lose everything because they trust too long." When Eleanor walked out of the lawyer's office, the sun felt warmer than usual, not because the day had changed, but because something within her had. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't waiting for Richard to remember who she was. She was beginning to remember it herself. Back at home, Richard didn't suspect anything. He continued to act as though the request was still pending, still just a casual matter of future planning. But Eleanor saw through him now. The man she had once loved fiercely was becoming a stranger, someone more interested in control than companionship, someone who saw her not as a partner but as a stepping stone to solve his problems. She began locking the drawer where she kept the property documents, began organizing her finances, listing what was in her name and what wasn't. She even called her children, not to alarm them, but to reconnect. In their voices, she found a reminder of herself, a woman who had given everything, sometimes too quietly. The days passed in a strange quiet. Richard didn't press again, but she could tell he was waiting. Eleanor was no longer just a woman in mourning over a forgotten anniversary. She was someone rebuilding a foundation that had cracked long ago. In that quiet, she made a decision. She wouldn't give him the house papers. Not now. Not ever. But she wouldn't scream. She wouldn't fight like he expected. She would dismantle the illusion gently, piece by piece. And when the time came, she would remind him that forgetting her wasn't just a slip, it was the costliest mistake of his life. The days following Richard's request were a quiet storm within Eleanor. On the surface, she maintained the same rhythm, watering her plants every morning, reading in the afternoon, making dinner before sunset. But inside, she was unraveling, a thread of memory and grief she hadn't touched in years. The house that had once brought her comfort now echoed with doubts. She began walking its hallways differently, as if trying to find signs of when things began to shift, when the man she married became a man she no longer recognized. Every creak in the floorboards and every faded photograph seemed to whisper parts of a story she had long ignored. It had always been easier to forgive the small things, the late arrivals, the forgotten promises, the sharp words spoken during stress. She had chalked them up to work pressure, aging, distraction. distraction, or just the ordinary roughness of life. But now, she couldn't deny that this was different. Richard's sudden interest in her house felt more like an invasion than a request, and that feeling was pulling her back through time, unlocking doors to memories she had kept shut for decades. She went to the old wooden chest at the back of her closet. Inside, beneath layers of winter clothes and keepsakes, were boxes of letters and photographs. Eleanor took out a small album with peeling corners and opened it slowly. The images inside were from their early years, Richard in his 30s, with a confident smile and thick black hair, Eleanor beside him, wearing a sari her mother had gifted her, smiling as though the world belonged to them. They were standing in front of the same house that surrounded her now, except it hadn't been built fully, then just the frame, the skeleton of the life they were meant to create. She remembered the struggle. Richard was between jobs back then, dreaming big but unable to find stable footing. It was Eleanor's inheritance that had helped them purchase the land. Her father had left her money, urging her to use it wisely. Richard had promised to pay it back, to contribute equally as the house took shape. But the repayment never came, not in money, and not in gratitude. Eleanor had buried that disappointment because she loved him. Because love, in those days, meant endurance. She could still hear her mother's warning, "Don't let love blind you to silence." Eleanor had laughed at the time, thinking her mother was being cynical. But now, those words rang loudly, like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. Over the years, Eleanor had given up her work, her career ambitions, her inheritance, all in the name of their life together. And now, decades later, Richard had the audacity to ask for the house papers like it was a simple thing, like it didn't hold the weight of her sacrifices, the imprint of her youth. Later that evening, she sat at the kitchen table and began writing in her journal again, something she hadn't done since her 30s. Her handwriting was shakier now, but the thoughts poured out clearly. I built this house not just with money, but with dreams. Every corner holds my choices, my time, my surrender. He sees it as a property. I see it as memory wrapped in walls. The journal became her quiet refuge, a place where she could untangle the sadness without interruption. As she wrote more, other memories began rising, ones she hadn't expected. She remembered a night in their second year of marriage when Richard came home smelling like perfume. She had asked, and he had laughed it off, saying it was a colleague's birthday and someone sprayed everyone for fun. She hadn't believed him fully, but she hadn't questioned it further. They had a baby on the way, and the house construction was half done. She didn't have the strength to confront, only to survive. There were other moments, to his long absences during business trips, the vague phone calls, the sudden unexplained expenses. Eleanor had told herself that all marriages had their cracks, she just had to paint over them. But now those old doubts resurfaced with new clarity. Perhaps she hadn't painted over cracks. Perhaps she had sealed away evidence. She started watching Richard more closely. His routines, his expressions, the way he checked his phone. She noticed how he took his calls outside now, especially when speaking in hushed tones. He had become secretive, guarded, and overly polite. The politeness stung more than cruelty. It meant he was managing her, not loving her. One evening, she followed him not far, just enough. He said he was going to meet an old friend at the park. Eleanor waited 10 minutes, then walked the same route, staying at a distance. She saw him sitting on a bench, talking to a woman, in her 40s, well-dressed, smiling, and far too familiar with him. He laughed in a way he hadn't laughed with Eleanor in years. That laugh used to be hers. She didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she returned home and sat in the living room, staring at the family photographs. Her eyes rested on one picture of Richard holding their daughter at her wedding. His smile in that photo was the same one he had worn on the park bench. The next morning, Eleanor took out the house papers again and read every line. Then she placed them in a secure file and moved them to a new hiding place beneath the floorboards of the prayer room, where she used to meditate in her 50s, a place he never visited. In the days that followed, Eleanor started changing quietly. She no longer asked Richard if he wanted tea. She no longer waited for him to join her for walks. She reclaimed small parts of her life. She visited the local library, joined a community art class, and called her daughter more frequently. She told no one of what she'd seen or felt. She carried it alone, but not with sorrow, with strategy. What surprised her most was not Richard's behavior, but how quickly she could adapt to it. It wasn't pain anymore, it was awakening. Every betrayal from the past came into sharper focus, not to break her, but to sharpen her. Asterisk, she remembered how, years ago, she had caught a fever while Richard was away. She was bedridden for 3 days, and no one came. Their children were in school, and Richard didn't call. When he returned, he shrugged off her weakness, asking if dinner would still be ready. She had smiled then, weakly, telling herself he was just tired. But that smile had been her first surrender. Now she understood. One surrender leads to another, until you don't recognize yourself. Asterisk, but Eleanor was beginning to recognize herself again in her solitude, in her quiet resistance, in her refusal to forget. Asterisk, one afternoon, she sat by the garden and read a line from a book that struck her deeply. Some women don't burn bridges. They light them for warmth and walk away when they are done. Asterisk, she closed the book and whispered to herself, I am not done yet, but I am lighting the first match. Asterisk, she started researching legal rights for elderly women, especially regarding property and financial abuse. The statistics shocked her. Too many women like her had given everything and ended up with nothing. Eleanor had always believed she was smarter than that, immune to such stories, but she wasn't. No one was immune to love that turned into manipulation. Asterisk, she didn't feel humiliated anymore. She felt educated. A kind of knowledge born from wounds, from staying quiet too long. Richard might think she was still the same woman who cooked his meals and folded his shirts without question, but he didn't know what she now remembered. And memory was power. Asterisk, the house, once filled with warmth, now stood as her witness. It knew her fears, her strength, her silence, and her awakening, and it would not be taken from her, not by charm, not by deception, and certainly not by a man who once promised to protect it. Asterisk, Eleanor was no longer the woman who needed someone to remember her anniversary. She had remembered herself, and that was more important than any date on a calendar. Asterisk, Eleanor awoke that morning to the sound of birds chirping outside her bedroom window. The sun had only just begun to stretch its fingers across the sky, casting golden light on the curtains. The house was still, but there was a strange electricity in the air, a quiet tension that hummed beneath the surface. She sat on the edge of her bed, her feet touching the cold floor, and for a moment, she simply breathed, trying to hold on to the calm before the inevitable chaos. Asterisk, she knew something was coming. Richard had been watching her differently lately, as though trying to guess what she knew, what she was thinking, how much control he still had, ever since she had quietly rejected his request for the house papers. Or at least delayed it with a gentle aisle. Think about it. His demeanor had shifted. He was no longer the careless man who forgot anniversaries and assumed she would always be there. He had become calculating, polite, to the point of discomfort. Helpful in ways that didn't suit him, speaking with too much restraint, as though measuring every word. Asterisk, that morning, over breakfast, Richard casually asked if she'd had a chance to dig out the documents. Eleanor smiled over her cup of tea and shook her head gently. Not yet. I've been busy with some other things. Asterisk, he didn't press. He just nodded and continued eating, but she could see the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. That was confirmation enough. This wasn't a simple request anymore, it was a plan, and she was no longer pretending not to see it. Asterisk, after he left for the day, she went into the prayer room, closed the door, and pulled up the floorboard where she had hidden the folder. She laid it on her lap and stared at it for a long time. These weren't just papers. They were her safeguard, her last defense against a storm that had already begun to shake the foundation of her life. She held them to her chest for a moment, and then locked them away in a small safe she had installed recently, quietly, discreetly, without telling anyone. Asterisk, later that afternoon, she visited the lawyer again. This time, she brought the documents with her. The lawyer reviewed them and nodded, satisfied that everything was in order. Eleanor explained her concerns, not just about Richard's request, but about the strange feeling that he was planning something without her consent. Asterisk, you're doing the right thing, the lawyer said calmly. Too many women come to me. After everything has already been signed away, you still have control. Let's keep it that way. Asterisk, Eleanor left the office feeling both exhausted and relieved. She wasn't used to being the one making legal decisions or keeping secrets, but something inside her had shifted permanently. She no longer felt bound by the quiet, obedient version of herself that had existed for decades. She was now operating in a different mode, silent defense. Asterisk, in the evenings, She resumed old routines with a new mind. She cooked dinner, listened to the news, made polite conversation, but she watched everything. Richard's restlessness, the way he checked his phone under the table, how he seemed distracted and impatient when she spoke. He was waiting for something, and she knew it wasn't about taxes or joint names. It was about control. Asterisk then came, the envelope. Asterisk one evening, as they sat together, watching television. Richard suddenly turned to her and said, "Oh, by the way, I brought something for us to look at." He reached into his bag and handed her a sealed envelope. Inside were 2 copies of a document, one blank for signature, the other partially filled. Her eyes scanned the header, Power of Attorney. She looked at him, her face calm. "What's this for?" Asterisk. He gave a rehearsed smile. "Just a precaution. It's easier for one of us to manage the house affairs legally, especially if the other is unwell or unavailable. You know how health can be at our age. It's smart to be prepared." Asterisk. Her fingers gripped the paper slightly. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about complete authority. This document would give him the power to act on her behalf. Bank accounts, for sales, for everything she had built. Asterisk. She folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's good to be prepared. Let me sleep on it." He nodded, clearly disappointed but trying not to show it. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep much. She walked the halls of her home like a ghost revisiting the past, her hand sliding across the staircase railing she had painted herself one summer, her eyes landing on the marks on the kitchen wall where the children had measured their height over the years. Every corner told a story. Every room whispered of choices, of survival, of a woman who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Asterisk. She opened her journal again and wrote, Asterisk. He no longer asks, he expects. And that's what frightens me the most, not his ambition, but his assumption that I will obey without question. Asterisk. The next morning, Eleanor took the power of attorney document and burned it in the backyard. She watched the paper curl and blacken in the fire pit, the smoke rising into the morning air like a signal of quiet rebellion. There would be no signatures, no surrender. Asterisk. Richard asked about it that evening. She told him she lost the envelope. Asterisk. He stared at her for a moment, suspicious, but then looked away. "Well, I can always get another copy," he muttered. Asterisk. "Of course," she said, sipping her tea. Asterisk. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor continued preparing. She made copies of all her legal documents, updated her will, created a financial record that was private and protected. She began withdrawing small amounts of cash from their joint account and placing them in a separate one under her name only. She started speaking with her daughter more often, reconnecting with old friends she had once drifted away from. She needed her network. She needed her voice back. Asterisk. Then one evening, Eleanor overheard a conversation Richard didn't mean for her to hear. He was in the study, speaking on the phone with someone he called brother-in-law, though Eleanor knew it was no blood relative. Asterisk. She's still stalling. Says she'll think about it. But I need those papers soon, or the deal will fall through. No, she has no idea. She trusts me too much. Asterisk. Eleanor froze in the hallway. Her heartbeat slowed into a terrifying stillness. This wasn't just a selfish man. This was a man plotting behind her back, believing she was too old, too soft, too dependent to resist. Asterisk. She returned to the kitchen and made dinner like always, but her hands were no longer trembling. They were steady with purpose. Asterisk. That night, she left a voice message for her lawyer, detailing what she had heard and asking for a formal notice of separation to be drawn up financially and legally. Not divorce yet, not public, but a boundary, something Richard couldn't cross. Asterisk. She also made arrangements to transfer all ownership of the house into a legal trust, naming herself as the primary and only decision-maker. This wasn't about revenge. It was about safety, about not becoming another nameless woman in a legal statistic, robbed in old age by the very person she had built a life with. Asterisk. When Richard came to her again, 2 days later, envelope in hand, pushing the documents once more with that same sugary tone, she met his gaze fully. Asterisk. I've already spoken to a lawyer, she said plainly. There won't be any power of attorney, and you'll be hearing from them soon. Asterisk. His face dropped, just slightly, before contorting into something in between confusion and anger. What's gotten into you, Eleanor? Asterisk. She stood tall, shoulders back. Wisdom, finally. Asterisk. There was a long silence. Then he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. So, that's it. You think you're suddenly some independent woman, No, she replied, her voice calm and cutting. I've always been independent. I just stopped pretending I wasn't. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Eleanor sat down in the living room, lit a candle, and for the first time in years, smiled not with joy, but with resolution. The storm had come, and she had stood still, unshaken. The house grew quieter with each passing day, but the silence was no longer a sanctuary. It was a shield Eleanor carried like armor. Richard had changed since the confrontation. He no longer asked about the house papers. He didn't push the power of attorney forms. He didn't even look at her the same way. There was a guarded distance in his demeanor now, like a man who realized the chessboard had shifted and his queen had moved without warning. But Eleanor didn't trust the calm. It felt too deliberate, too performative. Richard had become courteous, again too courteous. He offered to make tea, watered the plants she usually cared for, even complimented her blouse one morning. It was all so out of character that Eleanor found herself constantly watching his movements, unsure whether he was hiding guilt or planning something new. She decided it was time to know, not just suspect. Her lawyer had already helped secure the house under a living trust in her name alone, and all legal authority had been shifted away from Richard. But paperwork wasn't enough. Eleanor needed clarity, not only for her safety but for her peace of mind. She needed to know who he was, now not the man she married, not the father of her children, but the man sitting across from her at dinner, speaking in half-truths and hollow laughter. One afternoon, Eleanor waited until Richard left the house to meet a friend and followed him again. This time not on foot, but by quietly hiring a local rickshaw to tail him from a distance. She sat in the back, her scarf draped loosely around her head, as the vehicle rolled slowly behind Richard's car through narrow streets and quiet turns. He parked near a modest cafe just outside town, a place they had never visited together. Eleanor sat at a distance and watched as a woman emerged from the entrance and greeted him with a warm, familiar smile. It was the same woman from the park, the one he had claimed was an old colleague. They sat together, leaned in close, shared a drink. There was no subtlety in their body language. They knew each other well. It wasn't just the infidelity that hurt, it was the casualness of it. The way he had inserted this woman into his life like Eleanor was no longer part of the picture. She felt like a ghost watching her own replacement, but she didn't cry. Not there, not then. Instead, she took out her phone, snapped a quiet photo from a distance, and returned home. She didn't know what she would do with the evidence. She didn't even know if she wanted a confrontation. What she did know was this: she would not allow herself to feel helpless ever again. That night, Richard returned home later than usual. Eleanor was in the garden, trimming her roses, her hands dirt-streaked and calm. He greeted her with the usual pretense, asking if she had eaten. She nodded but offered no warmth. She was done pretending. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, and that was enough. The next morning, she began organizing the house, not just cleaning, but mentally preparing. She boxed up old photo frames, wrapped delicate glassware, and labeled files. It wasn't that she planned to leave, but she wanted to be ready if she needed to. A woman who has lived through betrayal twice learns to never be caught unprepared. In the evenings, she began spending more time in the prayer room, not always praying, but meditating, reflecting, whispering her thoughts into the silence like prayers that only the walls could hear. She began writing more in her journal. He is not sorry. He is simply unsettled that I no longer obey. I see now that forgetting the anniversary wasn't forgetfulness. It was a sign. And the request for the house, that was the cost of his silence. A week later, Eleanor's suspicions were confirmed when a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to Richard, but the return stamp gave it away a finance company. Curiosity became urgency. She waited until Richard left for groceries and then opened the envelope with trembling hands. The contents were devastating. It was a pre-approval offer for a mortgage loan against her house. He had already begun the paperwork weeks ago. The form was partially filled out, listing the house value, projected income, and Richard's name alone. Nowhere was Eleanor's name mentioned. She sat down, her knees buckling, the paper shaking in her fingers. This wasn't a plan, it was an execution in motion. He had intended to go through with it, to offer their home as collateral for whatever financial mess he had gotten himself into. Maybe a failed investment, maybe debts, Maybe the woman from the cafe, it no longer mattered. What mattered was that he had done it without her knowledge, without her signature, without her consent. When Richard returned that evening, he found Eleanor sitting calmly in the living room. The document lay on the coffee table between them, perfectly centered. He paused at the sight of it, then glanced at her. You opened my mail, he asked, feigning indignation. I read what concerned me, she replied. There was a silence. I was going to tell you, he said eventually, rubbing the back of his neck. It's just a backup plan. We've had expenses. And I thought, you thought what? She interrupted, her voice level but sharp. That I wouldn't notice. That I'd just sign whatever you put in front of me. That I'd give up the only thing in my name so you could play games with other people behind my back. He didn't answer. He didn't deny it either. You forget, she continued. I paid for this house. My father helped me. I built this home before we even had children. I painted its walls, chose its floors, repaired its leaks, and you were ready to gamble it away without even asking. Still, he said nothing. Eleanor stood slowly, picking up the document and tearing it cleanly down the middle. She let the pieces fall to the floor like autumn leaves. I've already transferred ownership to a legal trust, she said quietly. You have no rights over it now. Not a single brick. His face went pale. The pretense fell away, and, for the first time in weeks, she saw the real Richard cornered, powerless, and resentful. I was trying to protect us, he said, a final grasp at justification. No, she replied. You were trying to protect yourself, and I'm no longer the woman who lets you. He stormed out of the room again, but the drama didn't shake her. She picked up the torn papers, threw them in the trash, and sat down at her desk to write. He forgot our anniversary, but I remember everything now, and that memory is what will keep me safe. That night, she slept with her bedroom door locked, something she hadn't done in 45 years, not out of fear, but out of finality. The following day, Eleanor changed the locks on the front and back doors. She informed the lawyer to update the trust with a new clause. No cohabitation rights without written consent. If Richard wanted to stay in the house, he would need her permission in writing. She had the power now, out of revenge, but out of necessity. In the kitchen. She removed the joint calendar they had used for years, replacing it with a new one she kept just for herself. She began planning a trip to visit her daughter. She booked the tickets herself, without asking or informing Richard. She packed a small suitcase and placed it near the hallway quietly. That evening, she looked around the house and smiled, not because everything was resolved, but because she had resolved herself. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. They were holding her up. And when she passed by the mirror on her way to bed, she paused to look at her reflection. The woman staring back was older, wiser, and finally, undeniably free. Eleanor had always believed that the calmest moments in life came after storms. But what she was beginning to realize was that calm didn't mean pace, it often meant preparation. The house, once tainted by tension, now sat in quiet order. She moved through it like a woman reclaiming a legacy, not just cleaning and organizing but resetting the balance. Her movements were no longer hesitant or heavy. They were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Something inside her had shifted permanently, and though Richard remained in the house like a fading shadow, she no longer acknowledged his presence as a necessity. He was there, but he was not part of her anymore. After the confrontation over the mortgage documents, Richard hadn't tried to explain himself again. He had gone silent, sulking through days with clipped answers and prolonged absences. He came home late, sometimes not at all, and when he was present, the silence between them was cold, formal, and vast. Eleanor didn't mind. She preferred this version of him, distant, predictable, harmless. She used the quiet to her advantage. The legal separation of property had been finalized. Her daughter, when informed, had reacted with concern and confusion, but ultimately supported her mother's decision. I didn't know things had gotten this bad, she said during one of their late-night phone calls. Eleanor had only smiled on the other end. Neither did I until I looked closely. For Eleanor, each day became a quiet act of self-restoration. She took out old paintbrushes and returned to her art after years of abandonment. She converted the unused guest room into a small studio, a thing elaborate, just a canvas, a few shelves of supplies, and a chair that overlooked the garden. It was the same garden where she had once planted marigolds with her children, the same space where Richard had promised her a swing but never built it. Now, it was hers again, blooming not just with flowers but with intention. Asterisk, the painting helped. Her process, what words could not. Each brushstroke was a release, a way to paint over years of quiet endurance, a means of expressing what she had never said out loud. Her first painting was of a woman standing alone at the edge of a cliff, hair blowing in the wind, with the ocean raging below. She named it The Turning. Asterisk, it was around this time that she began to prepare for something deeper, a new life beyond the house. Eleanor didn't want to leave the home she had built, but she wanted the freedom to choose. So, she began learning things she had once relied on Richard for: how to manage digital banking, how to service the car, how to navigate legal notices and tax records. Each new skill was a brick in the foundation of her autonomy. Asterisk, she also began to socialize again. Slowly, cautiously, she reconnected with the world outside her gate. She attended a local book club, went to a women's luncheon organized at the community center, and started weekly yoga classes. These weren't just activities, they were symbolic acts of reintegration. For years, she had existed within the four walls of her marriage, seen by others only in relation to Richard. Now, she was meeting people as Eleanor, artist, mother, survivor. Asterisk, at first, the questions from acquaintances were delicate. "Where's your husband these days? You look different, Eleanor Hepburn," she responded politely, never bitter, but never lying either. "We're on different paths now," she would say, which was the truth, simple and sufficient. Asterisk, Richard, however, was not unaffected by her transformation. He noticed the changes, the locked doors, the phone calls she no longer took in front of him, the freedom in her posture. His silence began to give way to suspicion. One evening, as she was setting the table for herself, he asked bluntly, "What exactly are you planning?" Asterisk, Eleanor didn't look up from the plates. "Nothing you need to worry about. You've changed," he said, not kindly. "I've remembered who I am," she replied. Asterisk, it was perhaps the first time she had said it aloud, and the words settled into the room like a declaration. Richard didn't respond. He just stared at her for a long moment before retreating to his room. Asterisk, that night, she couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, but from clarity. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with purpose. She began writing again, letters to herself, letters she'd never send, thoughts scribbled in notebooks that filled quickly. In one of them, she wrote, Asterisk, "I am no longer asking permission to breathe. I am no longer waiting to be noticed. I am the author now, not the footnote." Asterisk, weeks passed in quiet determination. She continued painting, continued planning. She began drafting an exhibition proposal to the local art gallery. It was something she would have never dared before to bold the public, but now it felt right. She sent an email with photos of her work and was shocked when they responded within days. They loved her piece, The Turning. They asked if she had more. Asterisk, she cried when she read the message. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because it had been so long since someone had seen her not as a wife, not as a background figure, but as an artist, a creator, a woman with a voice. Asterisk, the gallery gave her a small weekend slot. She worked tirelessly, finishing 5 more pieces in 3 weeks. Each painting was a portrait of a different phase of her journey. The silence, the ask, the folded letter, the key, and finally, the calm before. Asterisk, on the day of the exhibit, she stood in the modest gallery hall, dressed in a light blue sari her mother had gifted her decades ago. Her hands trembled not from nerves, but from pride. The room filled slowly, some strangers, some familiar faces. Richard didn't come, she hadn't invited him, and she didn't need him to be there. One woman, elderly and soft-spoken, stood in front of the ask for a long time. It was a painting of 2 hands, one reaching out, the other pulling away, with the house floating in the background like a fragile balloon. She turned to Eleanor and said, "It's like you painted my life." Asterisk, Eleanor smiled, her eyes warm. "I think I painted all of ours." Asterisk, that night, she returned home to an unusually quiet house. Richard's car was gone. No note, no explanation. Just absence. And for the first time in a long while, that absence felt like a gift. Asterisk, she sat down in her studio, lit a candle, and began working on a new piece. The canvas was blank, the room softly lit. Outside, the The wind carried the scent of jasmine from the garden. She titled the new painting before the first stroke, * her name on the door, * it would be her final piece in the series, a self-portrait not of her face, but of the door to her home with a woman's nameplate on it, shining quietly in the afternoon sun. * She went to bed that night without locking the door, not because she trusted again, but because she no longer needed to be afraid. The locks had served their purpose, not just physically but emotionally. She had reclaimed her story, and she was just getting started. The sun rose gently on what was once a sacred day Eleanor had once awaited with the same quiet hopefulness every year. It was their anniversary again, a date that had once been marked with flowers, dinner reservations, and long, nostalgic conversations about their early days. But today, there were no illusions. This anniversary was not a celebration, it was a milestone of clarity, a symbol of distance rather than closeness. Eleanor stood by the kitchen window, cradling a cup of warm tea between her palms. She watched as the morning light danced across the dewless leaves in the garden. The house was silent, but the silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like space, room to breathe, room to think, room to live without fear of emotional turbulence. It had taken her nearly a year to reach this state of stillness, and she wasn't about to let the memories of what this day used to be disrupt the peace she had worked so hard to build. Richard, true to form, had not remembered the date, or perhaps he had, but chose not to acknowledge it. Either way, his absence from the morning table confirmed everything Eleanor already knew. There was nothing left to salvage in their marriage. There was only the final chapter to close. In the weeks leading up to this day, Eleanor had been preparing something quietly, with the same care she once used to plan their anniversaries. But this time, the gift wasn't wrapped in ribbons or placed in a candlelit setting. It was tucked inside a legal envelope, waiting in the drawer of her writing desk. She retrieved it mid-morning, running her hand over the sealed flap one last time before placing it in the center of the dining table. The white envelope contrasted starkly with the warm wood symbol, clean, undeniable. Inside, it was a final message to Richard, a packet containing divorce papers, a formal notice of financial separation, and a letter stating the decision in her own words. When he returned in the afternoon, she was sitting in the living room, painting a new canvas titled Departure. It was abstract, sweeping shades of gray and crimson, intersecting lines breaking away from one another like roads diverging under tension. Richard entered the house quietly, the sound of his keys rattling into the bowl at the entrance echoing slightly more than usual. He didn't greet her, not immediately. He paused at the dining table, his eyes falling on the envelope. What's this? He asked, picking it up as though it might burn him. She didn't look away from the canvas. A gift. Since you forgot last year and the year before, I thought I'd take the responsibility this time. He opened the envelope slowly, cautiously. His eyes scanned the contents. First the papers, then the signature, then the letter. He was silent for a long time. This is a joke, he finally asked. No, she said, her voice steady. It's my truth, and it's been building for a very long time. Richard dropped into a chair, the sound sharp in the quiet room. You want a divorce, after everything we've built. Eleanor set down her brush and turned to face him fully. We didn't build anything together, Richard. I built you've benefited. You walked into my house, used my father's money, used my time, my energy, and my trust, and you offered very little in return. This house stands because I refused to let it fall, not because you held it up. His jaw clenched. So, that's what I am to you now, a freeloader. She shook her head gently. You're someone I once loved, deeply, but love without respect becomes a kind of prison, and I have no desire to live inside walls that only echo disappointment. He stared at her, searching her face for signs of weakness, for the cracks where he might still push through, but they were gone. She wasn't the woman who once sat beside him in silence, hoping he would notice her pain. She was no longer asking for recognition. She had reclaimed herself. You've been planning this, he muttered, a bitter tone in his voice. Yes, she said simply, because I learned that silence is not the same as peace. I've spent too many years mistaking endurance for loyalty. I won't do it anymore. Richard set the papers down. And you think you'll be better off alone? I already am. Asterisk, he stood slowly, pacing the floor. What will the neighbors say? The children? What kind of legacy does this leave behind? Asterisk, Eleanor stood as well. Not to argue, but to close the distance that had long existed between them, not physically, but emotionally. I used to worry about those things too. What people would think, what the children might say. But I've realized something. Legacy is not about keeping up appearances. It's about honesty. And I want my children to know that their mother chose self-respect over silent suffering. Asterisk, he didn't respond. He didn't have to. Asterisk, I've given you decades of my life. Richard, she continued, but I'm not giving you what remains of it. I have work to do, paintings to finish, people to meet, a version of myself I haven't even fully discovered yet. Asterisk, he looked at her, something almost vulnerable in his eyes. So that's it. Asterisk, that's it, she said. Unless you want to fight me for a house you can no longer touch, or for a relationship you haven't nurtured in years. Asterisk, Richard sat back down. For a moment, he looked older than ever before, not from age, but from realization. The woman he once believed would never leave, never resist, never act had become the woman holding all the cards. Asterisk, I never thought it would end like this, he said, softer this time. Asterisk, neither did I, she replied, but endings aren't always tragedies. Sometimes they're just overdue beginnings. Asterisk, that evening, he left the house. Not in a rage, not in protest. He packed a small bag and walked out quietly, like a man finally recognizing his exile was not forced, but earned. Asterisk, Eleanor didn't watch him leave from the window. She returned to her studio and began working on her new painting. She poured a glass of red wine and played an old jazz record she used to love but hadn't listened to in years because Richard said it gave him a headache. Asterisk, the music filled the room, and for the first time in a long time, the sound didn't feel like a cover-up for silence. It felt like presence hers entirely. Asterisk, she picked up her brush and dipped it in a shade of gold she had never used before. Her strokes were confident, her hands steady. The canvas bloomed beneath her fingers, layer by layer, like a new skin, forming over an old wound. She wrote in her journal later that night, "Today was my anniversary, the day one married him, and now, the day I freed myself. 2 anniversaries in one. From now on, I'll celebrate this second one, the day I chose myself." Asterisk, she slept soundly that night. No locked doors, no thoughts of confrontation or betrayal, only dreams of open fields, of paint-streaked hands, of a front door with her name on it, and no one else's shadow on the threshold. Asterisk, outside, the moon cast its soft light over the house, once a battleground, now a sanctuary. And Eleanor, no longer waiting to be remembered, finally remembered everything that mattered. Her strength, her worth, and the beauty of a beginning dressed as an ending. Asterisk, the days after Richard's departure unfolded with a strange quietness, less like an ending, and more like a soft unraveling. Eleanor woke up in the same bed, opened the same curtains, and brewed the same tea, but the air around her felt cleaner. Somehow, there was a certain lightness to the silence now, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. For years, the house had absorbed the weight of unspoken grief, of neglected anniversaries, of quiet sacrifices and loud dismissals. Now, the space responded differently. It no longer echoed with tension, but hummed gently with possibility. Asterisk, for the first time in decades, Eleanor felt alone without feeling lonely. Asterisk, she walked through her home with a new gaze, one no longer clouded by duty or fear. She paused to truly see the old furniture, the chipped teacup she had kept, despite Richard's urging to throw it away, the embroidery she had stitched quietly during sleepless nights. These small things, once dismissed as background noise in a life spent serving, now became symbols of her resilience. Every corner of the house told a story of survival and now, of reclamation. Asterisk, she spent the mornings in her studio, painting not just for the upcoming exhibition but for herself. The latest piece she had been working on, The Calm After, was slowly taking shape. Unlike her earlier works, which were filled with sharp contrasts and bold declarations, this one was softer, full of pastels and gentle curves, like the tide returning to shore after a long storm. She found herself layering light upon light, allowing color to bleed naturally, not in battle but in harmony. It was a reflection of her emotional state, still healing, still uncertain, but undeniably hers. Asterisk, in the afternoons, she would walk in the garden barefoot, something she hadn't done since her children were young. the sensation of cool earth against her skin reminded her that she still belonged here. That the house, the land, the sky above her head were all part of her home, no longer just a backdrop for someone else's story. Sometimes she sat beneath the neem tree and read poetry aloud, letting the words drift into the breeze. She read Rumi, Emily Dickinson, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and sometimes she read her own journal entries, no longer just thoughts on a page, but affirmations of a woman rediscovered. One particular afternoon, while cleaning the storeroom, Eleanor found an old wooden box tucked beneath a pile of worn tablecloths. Inside were letters, love notes, cards, and little scribbled reminders Richard had once written to her in their early years. Her heart tightened as she read them. They were filled with warmth, affection, and the kind of hope that only young love carries. But instead of breaking down, she smiled because she had lived those moments. They were real, even if the love didn't last. She didn't regret loving him. She only regretted forgetting herself for so long. She tied the letters with a new ribbon, placed them back in the box, and labeled it a life lived. She didn't throw them away. They were part of her story, and she wasn't going to rewrite her past, only redirect her future. Evenings brought a new rhythm. Instead of setting the table for two, she set one place and made it beautiful. Her favorite china, a linen napkin, a single fresh flower in a vase. She cooked for herself as though she were a guest of honor, no longer rushing through meals or compromising on flavor. She made lentil soup with garlic naan one night, baked rosemary chicken the next, and even attempted a lemon tart after finding an old recipe card in her mother's handwriting. Music filled the kitchen, now soft gazzles, classical piano, sometimes even jazz. She danced once, alone, in the middle of the living room. It was clumsy and slow, but it made her laugh, really laugh, the kind that reached her chest and echoed in her bones. She twirled until she was breathless, collapsed on the sofa, and whispered to herself, "So this is what it means to be free." Neighbors began noticing the change. Mrs. Durrani from 3 houses down stopped by one morning with muffins and said, "You look younger somehow." Eleanor smiled and invited her in for tea. Over the next few weeks, more women from the neighborhood began to reconnect. Some were married, some widowed, some divorced. Each had their own silent stories. But with Eleanor, they found a new kind of space, a place where honesty didn't require shame. They started meeting every Sunday in her garden, calling it the Quiet Circle. They brought books, recipes, art supplies, and stories. They laughed, cried, and healed together. Eleanor never expected her home to become a haven for others, but now it was filled with life, not performance, with authenticity, not duty. One evening, while sipping tea on the porch, Eleanor saw a car slow down in front of her gate. She recognized it instantly. Richard stepped out, wearing a pressed shirt and that same cautious expression he had worn during their last conversation. He approached the gate but did not open it. He simply stood there. Eleanor stayed seated. "I just came to check in," he said. I wanted to see how you were." She nodded once. "I'm well." He looked down, uncomfortable. "You seem different." "I am." There was silence, the kind that once stretched painfully between them, but this time, she wasn't waiting for it to be filled. "I miss the house," he finally said. She tilted her head gently. "You don't miss the house, Richard. You miss the woman who kept it running. She's still here, but she doesn't live for you anymore." His eyes softened slightly, and for a brief moment, Eleanor saw a flicker of the man he used to be. The one who once wrote her poetry and planted lilies outside their bedroom window. But the moment passed. He nodded, understanding without further need for explanation. "I should go," he said. She didn't stop him, and he didn't ask to come in. As the car disappeared down the street, Eleanor didn't feel regret. She felt closure. That night, she sat at her writing desk and opened her journal once more. The pages were nearly full, and her handwriting had grown steadier with each entry. He came back, but only to see what he lost. "I didn't chase him. I didn't explain. I don't owe him a version of myself that no longer exists. I've stepped into a room I never knew was waiting for me, filled with windows, light, laughter, and doors I can open on my own." The next day, she began working on her last painting of the series' simple canvas, painted white with golden birds flying across it, each heading in a different direction. She titled it, "Freedom Does Not Apologize." Her exhibition approached, and the gallery team told her they had extended her showing by 2 more days due to the response. Local press had picked up her story. Late blooming artist finds her voice after 67 asterisk. She was invited to speak at a women's empowerment conference the following month. Asterisk her daughter was flying in for the show. Her grandson had promised to wear a bow tie just like Nano's art deserves. Asterisk life was no longer what she had planned. It was better. It was hers. The morning of the exhibition's final day arrived with a serenity that Eleanor could feel in her bones. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of her bedroom, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. The birds outside the window chirped without urgency, and the house hummed with stillness, not loneliness. There was no hurried breakfast to make for someone else, no anxious anticipation of how the day would unfold, no shadows of disappointment looming behind the door. There was only herself, her breath, her hands, and the promise of what was waiting beyond her front gate. Asterisk she stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric of her cream-colored cotton sari with deliberate grace. Around her neck, she wore a thin gold chain her mother had given her decades ago, a symbol of resilience passed from one woman to another. Her silver hair was neatly tied in a bun, and the fine lines on her face looked less like signs of age and more like etchings of wisdom, of stories lived and survived. Asterisk as she stepped into the hallway, her heels echoing softly against the wooden floor, she paused for a moment to glance at the small plaque by the front door, the one she had recently installed. Asterisk, it read, simply, Eleanor Singh, artist. It was not grand, but it was hers, her name, her identity, her truth. She smiled quietly to herself and stepped outside, locking the door behind her without hesitation. Asterisk, the gallery buzzed with quiet excitement when she arrived. Visitors moved between her paintings with curiosity and admiration. A soft instrumental track played in the background, weaving together the atmosphere of thoughtfulness and emotion. Her canvases hung proudly along the white walls, each one a chapter. Each brushstroke a sentence written from her soul. Asterisk the turning, the ask, the silence, departure, the calm after, her name on the door. Freedom does not apologize. Asterisk, and now, the final piece stood at the center of the room, illuminated by a spotlight. It was the largest in the collection, a textured, layered portrait of a woman sitting at a window, sunlight bathing half her face, while the other half was cast in shadow. The room behind her was filled with soft symbols, a journal, a locked drawer, a lit candle, a pair of empty slippers. Outside the window, birds flew freely in every direction. Asterisk, the title was simple, Becoming. Asterisk viewers stood in front of it for long stretches of time. Some moved to tears, others simply awed into silence. Eleanor stood off to the side, quietly observing. She didn't crave praise, only understanding. And from the expressions on people's faces, she knew they understood. They didn't need to know her exact story. They could feel it. That was the power of truth when poured into art. It transcended explanation. Asterisk, her daughter arrived mid-morning, her arms wide open. They embraced tightly. It wasn't just a hug between mother and child. It was a reunion between two women who had grown in different ways, yet found strength in one another. Asterisk, you did it, Ma, her daughter whispered. You really did it. Asterisk, Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening. I finally stopped waiting. Asterisk later, her grandson toddled up to her wearing a miniature bow tie, pointing excitedly at the ask. Asterisk, is that you, Nano? He asked. Asterisk, yes, darling, she replied, crouching beside him. That was me, but now I'm more like the lady over there. She pointed to Becoming. Asterisk, he nodded solemnly, as if understanding something only children could without needing logic. Asterisk, the exhibition continued with a small speech from the gallery director, who introduced Eleanor not only as a late-blooming artist, but as a woman who had redefined what it meant to begin again. Eleanor, at first hesitant to speak publicly, stepped up to the small podium in her soft, unhurried grace. Asterisk, I thought my story had ended, she began. I thought the rest of my life would be spent watching others live, others decide, others speak. But something remarkable happens when you begin to listen to your own silence. You realize it was never emptiness, it was a pause, and sometimes the most beautiful art begins at the end of what you thought was your masterpiece. Asterisk, the applause was warm and long, but Eleanor didn't linger in the spotlight. She returned to her corner quietly, back to observing, back to being with herself. Asterisk. That evening, after the gallery had closed and the walls were bare again, she returned home. The house welcomed her like a friend who had waited patiently, no questions asked. She set down her bag, removed her shoes, and walked through the rooms slowly, almost reverently. Asterisk. In the kitchen, she brewed chamomile tea and took it to the living room. The walls were lined now with new paintings, new colors, and in between them, older photos, now appreciated, not mourned. She no longer saw her past as a series of regrets. She saw it as a garden that had once gone untended but had bloomed again, stubbornly, gloriously. Asterisk. She sat by the window, notebook in her lap, pen in hand. The journal was nearly full now. Its pages were the true autobiography of her awakening. She turned to the last page and began writing slowly. Asterisk. I gave love. I gave years. I gave silence. And then, I gave myself permission. I am not angry. I am not broken. I am not the forgotten woman waiting by the door. I am the woman who walked through it, alone, and turned her solitude into art. I am the storm, and I am the sky after it. I am home. Asterisk. She closed the notebook, tied it with a soft ribbon, and placed it beside her on the WINDOWSILL. Asterisk. Outside, the sky shifted into hues of lavender and peach, the last light of day dancing on the horizon. She sipped her tea slowly, savoring the warmth. Then came a knock at the door. She stood, calmly walked to open it, and found Mrs. Durrani with a tray of sweets. I heard the exhibition was a success. She beamed. A little celebration from the neighborhood women. Asterisk. Eleanor laughed, accepting the tray. Come in, she said. Let's make some more memories. Asterisk. And just like that, her evening was filled again, this time not with obligation, but with laughter and shared stories. The house, once echoing with unmet expectations, now pulsed with life, with women who had stories like hers, who had endured and bloomed. Asterisk. That night, when everyone had left and silence returned, Eleanor walked into her studio one last time before bed. She stood in front of the final canvas, tracing the texture of becoming with her fingertips. She turned off the light and let the darkness settle softly around her. Asterisk. She no longer feared silence. She no longer feared being alone. Asterisk. She had become the woman who chose herself. Asterisk. And the house, once almost taken from her, now stood not as a possession but as a reflection. Not just a house, her home, with her name on the door.